who will be coming
That's
to
right.
make our office a clearinghouse. So at least then there's the potential for carpooling.
Yes,
So you might go, you shouldn't have to think, okay, I'm going to drive by myself.
correct.
Yeah, so you want to ride, is that what you
No,
want?
no, I was.
But why don't you take a ride?
But it's
Yeah.
just what the rabbi said about organizing a group.
Organizing a
Yeah,
group.
because it should be like an event. But I
Yes.
noticed there are nice restaurants there around. Maybe it could be a Sunday for lunch or something. I
Well,
don't
it wouldn't
know.
be like an official event to the extent that a synagogue really that observes kashrut shouldn't have an official event in a treif restaurant. That just doesn't look. So it wouldn't be an official event that all of Tree of Life is eating out at Smoking Joe's BBQ.
I don't think Erwin could do that. Because he couldn't, no. I have him registered to go, but I don't think he's going to go. But we were out today in the car for just a few, and he's like, yeah.
It's exhausting.
No,
Probably his own suspension system couldn't tolerate the bumps in the road.
but we had to try because we didn't know.
It's the only way to find out.
Yeah. So now we know. So now, but he wants to come tomorrow to the meeting here, but I don't think he's going to make it
Oh, I will be at the main, but I told you.
tomorrow.
Yeah, I can't do.
You can't hurt
Raise two
yourself.
hands.
You can't hurt yourself in half.
Well, I already cut it to.
No, I didn't tell you.
Oh, it's already done.
It's wonderful.
Wonderful.
Who knew?
Well,
I already did it. See, it's already gone.
Oh, okay, got it.
We'll be in charge of downstairs.
Okay, great.
How you doing today?
I'm doing good. How's it feeling?
I'm sore today.
The weather has started.
Yes, that's exactly right. So I started eating like the last I was apart the other day, so I think
yeah.
what's she part, yeah. So I think I just told him like he wants me to start moving.
It has.
Yeah.
I did tell him it was not.
Yeah.
Mom was sure for the turn. Like I said, told him she agrees with me.
I bought a whole stack of monsters. You're really positive thinking. You're optimistic.
Positive thinking, right?
Really beautiful. Well, when they put that glass in up here, and the fan turns on, it looks like somebody that was under here.
I have to remember who I was talking to, and who was I talking to?
And it's
And I told them about how we have the high holidays here, and how certain things are covered up. And he said, "Oh, why do they cover them up? I would have no problems. I would like to do
Hey,
that."
at least it's not a Catholic church where you're going to cover 100
some
things.
people,
Would it Catholic church?
it bothers them
Oh, yeah.
just to walk in.
No, that's a very
I agree with you. I'm regretful.
right. Exactly. But I have to tell you,
You graduated?
this is where they had. This is where they had graduation.
No kidding.
That's where they did, we had that, they had that house on Fifth Avenue.
Right.
Fifth and Mental. Well, we had no auditorium or anything, so we used this. And my Orthodox grandfather came out here.
So my grandfather was Orthodox, he was a rabbi, he was Mashiach, he did Haver Kadisha, he did everything.
I'm going to be saying those hymns. I'm going to be saying those hymns that they sing here. Rabbi Friedman.
Now we can begin. I have an extra cane if you need, so all of us can just schlep up and down the aisles. If you want, we can enter you in the. Yeah. We're going to enter you in the first annual, instead of the running the roses, it's the 5-yard schlep.
Seriously, I have more than one cake. Oh, you do?
So we'll just race up and down the halls.
That's right, which is your bad leg.
Which you left also? Oh, because we need someone with a bad right, so we could do a three-legged race.
What's wrong with the front?
You'll see if you sit down and try to get up, there's not much knee room.
Okay.
That's why. I did brush my teeth. I even saw the dentist today, so
I was at the dentist.
I got it cleaned in time for tonight.
I'm not too old. Is this reserved?
There were some noted speakers in many faiths over the years who did not take to heart the phrase "say it, don't spray it."
Let's see.
You see that on Broadway, though. You see people spraying.
If you check the lighting, you can see there's far more aerosols than you ever realized on Broadway.
That's right.
That's why I give the sermon from up there. It dissipates by the time it. So it's 7:01. So also knowing the weather and how peculiar it is tonight and very unstable. So, but rest assured, we're in a good, safe space. Safer than your homes, for sure. So I'd like to just, for the benefit of those of you joining us in person or joining us virtually, to just give a bit of a synopsis of what I covered last time to set the stage for tonight's, because it's two sessions. You didn't need the first session for sure to get into the second, but it sure doesn't hurt to have the background of the first to understand the second. The structure and framework of our worship services was set roughly 2,000 years ago. Within that, they created a scaffolding over what are the consistent pieces that are always there. For example, there's always an Amida in every service, 3 times a day, on Shabbat and festivals, 4 times a day. So there's always an Amidah. We always sing Aleinu at the end, for example. There's always a mourner's Kaddish. There's certain set elements that always appear. When you go beyond the normal elements and you want to add things that are not found, you can't just up and do it. What they needed to do was to create these prayers. Literally, that means permission prayers, because the word reshut means permission. To ask permission of both the congregation in attendance and of God to include additions. So we have throughout the liturgy on high holidays, we don't see it as much in the festivals, but the high holidays, with all the poems and things that have been added, we have these permission prayers where the person leading the service, meaning Chazan or Shaliach Tzibor, who's the davener on behalf of the congregation, utters these permission prayers, asking permission to add them, as well as invoking God's name to give the strength to be able to do them and to do them properly from someone who doesn't feel that they're worthy. So what we did last time is take a look at some of those permission prayers. And they come in 3 different sizes, like anything else, like a Starbucks coffee. You can get a short permission prayer, you can get a medium-sized one, or you can get the Hineni, which is the big permission prayer. They're all permission prayers. So we spent time looking at the permission prayers. And then lastly, we took a look at a text that many of you know just by the first 2 words, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. And we just talked about why would God have 2 appellations on the high holidays? Isn't one sufficient? And which one is it? We always think of God as our Father. But then why specifically our King? Because we do mention God as King whenever we say bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam. Praise you, God, King of the universe. So we're always calling God King anyway. The ancients had a concept that God's sitting on a throne, like a chair, and God sits on a seat of judgment, regularly judging all on this planet. not just humans, but animals as well. However, with the coming of the High Holy Days, God gets off the throne of judgment, and we say God goes onto the throne of mercy, to not merely judge, but to judge with mercy. So that's the concept of Avinu Malkeinu, that God, we call upon you as our parent, to arise from your throne of judgment and take a seat on your throne of mercy and be merciful upon all of us. So those are some of the elements that we looked at last time. What I'd like to do today is really engage a little bit in some of the poetry that we find in the Machzor. Because if there's one thing that this book is filled with, it's magnificent poetry. Religious poetry, which is of a different nature than Longfellow or Walt Whitman or any of the others. Because of the religious nature of them, they're very different. When you go to synagogue, it's impossible to just take a seat and think that the Spirit is suddenly going to move you and you're going to be taken away into this euphoric state of being that's going to help you communicate better to God. The ancient religious poets had those same worries and problems and questions. How can I get moved? By what means can I do it? They composed these incredibly amazing religious poems. In Hebrew, we call it a piyut, which means a religious poem. Yet the fascinating thing, and it may just be a coincidence, piyut, poet, hear the similarity in sounds? Yet poet is French, piyut is ancient Hebrew. Pei, yud, vav, tet. In English, kind of P-I-Y-U-T, piyut. Nothing like peyote. Although if you take peyote, you might be in the religious frame of mind to enjoy the poems. I wouldn't know. The thing I always find about them, this is me, is they answer the question of how do I move myself into a higher religious state of being on the holidays with all the preparation you do. And I think the poets incredibly answer that challenge when you read their poetry, of putting you in a frame of mind after reading it to go, wow, to elevate your sense of being in that. So what I'd really like to just do today is expose you to some of those elements that are in there within this incredible book, to be able to see how did these incredibly gifted poets do this. Now keep in mind, not like today where, say, if I'm going to compose a sermon and I say, you know, there's a Talmudic source, I can't think of where it is, I can type in a search engine, I can find the source. In the days prior, no, you had to look through the Talmud and take the time and search and find and be able to figure out it's there somewhere. Where is it? Well, King David, as a poet, precedes them. His poetry was written 3,000 years ago. These are poets between the 7th and 15th century. Religious poets who, also like King David, did not have a place to go other than printed books to be able to find inspiration and to look and see, how did they find inspiration? What defines it as a poem versus prose? What are the elements that one might look for to identify poetry as being Jewish poetry, as religious poetry? What makes it such? What are the defining characteristics? So we're going to look at some today. The first we're going to take a look at is page 164. I apologize in advance for those of you joining us virtually who do not have a Machzor with you. I'll do my best to read it to you, and we're going to be taking a look at it as well. So what we find in 164 and 165, what happens first? First is the opening paragraph of the Amidah. This paragraph opens every Amidah every single day of the year. Every Amidah opens with this opening paragraph. which praises God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. That's the opening paragraph, essence. We're saying to God, God, remember the good old days with Abe and Sarah? Those are really fun times, weren't they? Well, think of us in the same joyous manner as you would them. Then what follows is this little paragraph in Hebrew, Misod Chachamim, in English, with the inspired words of the wise and the discerning. That's the permission paragraph. So why is there a permission paragraph inserted here? Because we're about to recite a religious poem. Of course they put it in size 5 font. We're about to recite a religious poem. Before we could do it, we need permission to be able to do it. So the permission paragraph is uttered first, which is though an assent. And it's not that you're going to have in services suddenly after the chazan, whoever it would be, recites it, someone in the back goes, I object! I don't want that poem. It doesn't work that way. The permission is sort of it's given. It is. No one's going to object. If you don't, well, remember who you are. Come Yom Kippur and your attempts at forgiveness. So we ask permission. Then we have this beautiful poem. So just for the benefit of those who are joining us at home, I'm going to read a little of it to give you a little of the flavor. Then we're going to look at it in a little more depth. With trembling, I begin my plea, rising to entreat the awesome, exalted one. Deficient in good deeds, I stand in fear. Limited in wisdom, how dare I hope? My Creator, teach me to transmit our heritage. Strengthen and support me, lest I falter in fear. Let my whispered prayer be like incense rare, and my spoken plea like sweetest honey. Accept my prayer, reject it not. May it win pardon for those whose emissary I am. Wow. So we see here the same type of language that we find in the permission prayers that we looked at last week, in the same concepts that we find in the Hineni, which was written somewhere, we think, around the 13th century. We're not 100% sure, because people didn't put a note in and sign their name and put the date that they wrote it. A lot of this was composed, if not in advance, on the spot. So it's not uncommon. Many of these were impromptu improvisations without any pre-planning. But again, we have the person leading services trembling because of the responsibility of representing the congregation before God. First off, that's an incredible responsibility. Number two, trembling because they're in the presence of God. Number three, speaking about how unworthy they are to do that. And that's the essence of this prayer. But there's some other beautiful elements that, regrettably, reading the English doesn't give enough of the flavor. So we need to take a look at a little of the Hebrew. Not per se because you would understand the Hebrew, but appreciate the language. Okay. So if we look in the first line, the fourth word, just before the period, we see the word lahashchil. Remember that word, I'm going to come back to it. Look at the end of the first line, the last word, vidachil. Remember that sound, I'm going to come back to it. Second line, fourth word, azchil. Second line, eighth word, ochil. Do you hear a rhyming? Every phrase ends with chil. What does chil mean? Chil is an ancient word for trembling. The theme of this entire poem is trembling, but every word at the end of each phrase ends with chil, which doesn't mean the word means trembling, but the essence of trembling is contained in every word here. Every word that ends in chil doesn't mean that it's the word chil. It's as though this poet had a mental thesaurus and was able to call upon every Hebrew word he could think of. Sorry, ladies, there weren't women poets that had opportunities to compose in these books. Women poets wrote small prayer books mostly in Yiddish for women to pray out of, because women in Europe, for example, weren't given the opportunity to learn Hebrew. Up to this day, there were many women who did not have a bat mitzvah because they weren't taught Hebrew. But there were many talented women who had opportunities for advanced study, and they would write beautiful poetry, most of it in Yiddish, and they would make a woman's siddur, that the women in the balcony, that's what they said, would be reading that and inspired by that. So I use the language by default because it was men. But here, the poet literally had a thesaurus in his head and could think of every noun or verb, in this case they're all verbs, that all end with the word chil to find a rhyme. So had a rhyming dictionary literally in his head, or would make a list of every word I could think of with chil and now create a phrase. Not all, but most of these stanzas really, because it's a poem, are 4 words. 4 words, and the last syllable of each stanza is chil. What incredible skill to be able to do that and focus again on chil as the rhyming element, but also recognizing for those who were good enough to recognize it. Remember, the Machzor wasn't in English. English wasn't around as a language yet. English is really, modern English is 1,000 years old. Hebrew is like 6,000 years old. So we're just a little bit older. And that the poet would know, chil is the essence. Chil is the connector that winds through this entire beautiful poem to be able to say, trembling. Yes, Marlene.
So it's a positive heel, trembling, positive word. My son's Hebrew name is Yechiel, and he said, how could you name me something that means tremble and shake? But it's not pejorative.
It's not meant either as a positive or negative, but a descriptor of how one would feel. In this case, who was saying this? The only person saying this generally is the Chazan. This is the words of the Chazan, first person singular, I, not we. Remember, most of our Hebrew prayers are we, right? This is I, first person singular. This is recited only by the Chazan. And the trembling is, again, the twofold trembling. One of not being worthy of representing the congregation, so trembling because of that awesome responsibility. And secondly, trembling because they're literally standing before the throne of the Almighty, and how awesome that is. I would sort of compare it in a way, it's like my first high holidays as a student Chazan. You can certainly understand trembling as you're singing stuff, and your book is like, right? So think of that, but now think of the awesome responsibility of representing the people and standing before God, and how that could move a human being to tremble. What's the Hebrew word that we call the really pious that live in Israel? Emei Sherim. Not Hasidim, which are the pious ones. The really pious ones? Because the word just went right out of my head. Come on, somebody help me. It'll come to me. But what does it mean? The people who tremble before God. Many thought that part of the movement of the human body when we shuckle before God is part trembling also. So trembling is an element of the awesomeness of the day.
That's right. I see people pray, they're moving.
Well, also we find in one of the Psalms we say towards the end of the Nishmat, this big paragraph before Shochinat on Shabbat morning, that King David writes, all my bones shall praise you, O God. So the shuckling is a reflection of that verse. How do all my bones praise you? By moving. So we have here this incredible paragraph of trembling, of awe, standing before God, and the incredible responsibility of the Chazan who's leading the prayer. And what's also incredibly powerful about it is the last word of this poem is the word atchil, which means I begin. Now, most people think, okay, it's another chil word, right? Here's what you don't know, because in modern machzorim, they've gotten rid of a lot of the poems. The next poem that was usually recited in most synagogues began with the words atchil. So the poet knew that, and thus ended his poem with the last word being the first words of the next poem, to create this beautiful connectivity from one to the other, and knew that. So these themes are ones that we find throughout, particularly coming out of the mouth of the Chazan, these continued themes. So here you see a reflection of how the person felt. And if you think about that, how personal that is. They're telling their own story of how they feel of the day. What that also tells us is this: the person who wrote this he lived in the 11th century in Speyer. Speyer was one of three cities in the central part of Germany, major Jewish centers of life: Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Three major population centers for German Jews. He lived in the 11th century. His name was Yekutiel ben Moshe. 11th century, he wrote this. Yes, we know a different name, Yekutiel. So he wrote this. It's clear that if he wrote this, and this is how he feels, he wrote this from experience. Why? The only way he could have experienced this set of emotions is if he served as a chazan. Because the one who would feel the weight of that responsibility of serving the congregation to represent them before God and then being before God is you'd have to be a chazan. So he had to have served as a chazan to get it. It's not that if you're not a chazan, you don't get it. I'm not suggesting that. But from personal experience, he was able to write this incredibly powerful poem. And the thing is that this was such an incredible poem, it was added to the machzor, and you'll see it in most machzorim. First day Rosh Hashanah, the repetition of the Shacharit Amidah. This is the first poem that is added. Yes?
Would it be because he was more connected to the music behind the poem and prayer?
I don't think so.
Not necessarily.
Music is more the vehicle, although sometimes music, as we know, can set the mood and transcend words. I mean, the one that comes to my mind immediately is Kol Nidre. The Kol Nidre, despite the text and what it says, that age-old melody, that haunting melody, transcends the text and moves us to places beyond what the text says. So sometimes it can be melody, but I'm just, and this is my own experiences as a chazan, the awesomeness of the day, of the moment, of the responsibility, moved him to be able to write this personal expression of how he felt. And it became, again, so powerful that it's in there. So I wouldn't think it was the music. I would think it was just the experience of doing it. And it's recited first day. On the first day, after that's concluded, you can see the note towards the bottom of page 164. We continue with Zochreinu L'chaim on page 166. But before we do that, we're going to look at a different version, the poem for the second day. The poem for the second day, which begins the bottom of this same page, was written by Shimon ben Yitzchak, who lived in Mainz. So remember I said Speyer, Worms, and Mainz? So he lived in one of the sister cities, shall we say? Let's see, what is his reflection on it? I'm going to read a little bit of it to you to share as well with those of you joining us virtually. With a heart deeply troubled, your mercy I implore, as I stand before you like a beggar at the door. From the depths of my heart to you I sing. Let me find shelter under your wing. See how they rhymed it? Surprise. It doesn't rhyme like that. That's the license that translators take to try to give a flavor of poetry to a Western ear unfamiliar with a different style of poetry. Let me read a little more. Seized with dread, shuddering with fear, to your awesome presence, how dare I draw near? I am deficient in virtue, knowledge I lack. I cannot approach you, fear holds me back. Hear the same themes? Exact same themes being expressed. Let's look at the Hebrew to appreciate a little bit of the flavor of it. So if we look at the last line, after the first 5 words, the last word is umurtach. Hold on to that sound. The last word at the end of the second phrase, bafetach. Next phrase, timtach. Next one, milah. Oops. What happened? Let's find out. Next phrase, kula. Next one, ochila. Next one, selah. So what is happening here? Hebrew poetry doesn't always have the last word of every stanza has the same sound. Sometimes they can alternate stanzas. Sometimes they could do 3 or 4 in a row and then move on to a different sound for 3 or 4 in a row. Like lecha dodi. Lecha dodi. In every paragraph, the first three lines of the stanza all rhyme. The last one ends in la. The next paragraph, the first 3 rhyme with each other. The last one is la. So it's really complex how the rhyme of lecha dodi goes. But what happens here? So we found the first 3 phrases end in tach. Okay? All right, that makes sense. Now, what happens to the next ones? The next ones end in la. How about the next ones? The next 3 end in a, but it's actually the next 4. Then we have ending in cha, 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 and cha. So you see here, most of them is a 4-pattern system, 4 phrases in a row with the same ending syllable. The next 4, a different ending syllable. Not unusual, a typical pattern of prayer. But not only that, something else that the poet did. Look at the first letter of the first stanza, back on 164, 3 lines up. The first letter is the letter, page 164, 3rd line up. First letter is a aleph. Go past the period. What's the first letter of the next word? Bet. What do you guess the next letter is going to be? Aleph, bet, gimel. So look at the next phrase. Gimel. And then the next one. Oops. What happened there? We'll come back to it and find out. Skip the 4th phrase. Go to the 5th phrase. See the dalet and davar? See it? The end of the second line, 3 words from the end. There's the dalet. I'll come back and show you what just happened here. Skip the dalet one. The next one is hey. The one after that is vav. And then what? An aleph again? So what's going on here? The poet has aleph, bet, gimel for the first 3 and then concludes with an aleph word. The next quadruple set, dalet, hey, vav, and concludes with an aleph again. Next one, zayin, chet, tet, concludes instead of an aleph and ayin. But aleph and ayin are interchangeable. That's okay. That's permitted. Then, what happens next? Yud, kaf, lamed, and then what? A tav. Huh? So what we find here is internal rhyming and playing with things, which is not unusual. But this entire poem follows alphabetical, aleph, bet, gimel, and then the 4th quatrain has a different letter. Then dalet, hey, vav, the next 3 letters, and then a different letter. So not only is the rhyming at the end, there's alphabetical at the beginning. So you're talking about layer upon layer of complexity, kind of like a really good pie crust. These different elements that go within it to make the whole thing just so splendid in such ways. But not only that, when you read it, you can hear there's rhyming within it, even though there's not always the same number of syllables. Atiti l'chananach b'lev karua umortach, bikesh rachamim ke'ani ba'petach, galgel rachamecha v'din al timtach, Adonai sifatai tiftach. There's a da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. There's an internal beat to it. It doesn't follow what we think of as Western poetry. This is Jewish, religious poetry.
Is he a musician as well?
Most chazanim had to be. They didn't necessarily play an instrument, although some may have, but they were musical enough to be able to appreciate poetry, rhyming mechanisms, the pulse of a phrase, the rise and fall of a melodic line. They had those skills. Chazanim did not attend a seminary because these didn't exist as seminaries. You apprenticed with a great cantor, if you were so lucky, by singing in his choir. Remember, the choirs are just boys. Singing in the choir, learning the liturgy through singing in the choir, perhaps getting voice lessons and private lessons, because the choirs were the private schools for the next generation of cantors. That's how cantorial education was going on in the Middle Ages in Europe. It was by apprenticing with a great cantor. And you would live with that cantor. You might go home to see your family if you were lucky once a year, but you would live and work with that cantor and that cantor's family. And the cantor frequently would have a group of boys that would live with the cantor, because cantors didn't serve one congregation. Synagogues didn't operate like that. Cantors frequently were itinerant, unless you had the privilege of serving in a massive community. So the 3 communities I mentioned, Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, were large enough communities that they could have a cantor in the community. Other communities that might be more modest in size, itinerant cantors would travel with their choir. And they would go from community to community to community, and that's how they earned a living. So young men would learn all of these skills. So they'd learn their Bible and their Talmud and all of this, as well as perhaps additional education in the community that they're in. So a lot of that was this private training that was going on. And you could see the benefit just from these 2 individuals here, the beautiful poetry that they were able to compose, independent of each other, but reflecting the ambiance of what religious poetry was about in that world at that time. Saying the same things in different ways, also demonstrating an incredible range of skills to be able to do that. I want to go on and look at another one now. To be appreciated, yes. And that's just the facts. That's most poetry in any language. If you are able to handle that language, there's an incredible degree of appreciation for it that you can have that the English can't come as close to appreciate. And that's just facts.
Well, when they translate things like this into English, and I understand this translation took place a lot later, I'm going to assume that everyone doesn't agree on how to translate these things.
Right, so Rose just asked about, is there one translation? The answer is no. There is no one agreed upon translation ever. There might be consensus, but more often than not, there are many things that they can't agree upon, which is what makes it translation. No, there are about 10 or 12 different translations of the Shema.
This was before the printing press, so this would be oral tradition.
Oral tradition. If you had the funds, You could buy parchment and write it down. If you didn't have the funds, you had incredibly talented people who could memorize vast sections. In the ancient Talmudic academies, they had young men there who were trained, who had didactic memories, who literally could memorize incredibly vast sections of the Talmud. There's this wonderful mythic story I learned when I first went to the Jewish Theological Seminary about a teacher there who, at the time, in his earlier years, had emigrated from Europe, and he was applying to the Jewish Theological Seminary to go to rabbinical school, despite the vast training, because to get ordained in the United States was an incredibly important thing in America. And it was suggested to him by other teachers or other people to don't embarrass the people interviewing you because you probably know more, and be polite and so forth. So I'm sort of ad-libbing the interview process. So they ask him, have you studied any Mishnah? Mishnah is the opening section of discussions on what the Torah means. It's the foundational piece of the Talmud. The Talmud is the Mishnah, which has 6 books, and then the Gemara, which is the explanation of the Mishnah, which is an explanation of the Torah. So the Mishnah is completed around the year 200. So they said, you know any Mishnah? I've studied a little bit of Mishnah. There have always been these incredibly talented men with didactic memories that can memorize vast tractates, and they were the recording secretaries for the yeshivot, who could then be called upon to say, didn't so-and-so say it in the year, 85 about it? And they could just go bing and pull it out. Because this is before you could type it in. So we're going to look at a different form of poem now on 168. This one's in bigger print, so it's easier to see. This is, the foundation of this is a different type of piyut, religious poetry. Its foundation is based upon a phrase. The phrase is the top phrase on the page. Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch, Le'olam Va'ed, which we've heard in many different settings, that it's 3 forms of the verb to rule, R-U-L-E. God rules, God has ruled, God will rule forever. All 3 forms of the verb, which speaks to God's eternity. This is the foundation, this short verse is the foundation for this entire piyut. How? Well, if you look at the end of each 3-unit stanza, you see that each stanza ends with Adonai Melech, Adonai Malach, Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. So you can see each 3-unit ends with it. But not only that, go to the end of each triple line. The first line ends with Adonai Melech. The second line ends with Adonai Malach. The third line ends with Adonai Yimloch. So throughout this entire piyut, the foundation of it and the theme is God's kingship. Remember I said, Avinu Malkeinu, God is king? Kingship of God is one of the themes of Rosh Hashanah. Why? What are we celebrating on Rosh Hashanah? The birthday of the world. God created it. God is king. So this is an entirely appropriate short text to say. So all of this is all about God being king. Now if we look at the first set of triple verses here, we find the first 3 lines, it begins with Aleph, the next line begins with Bet, the next line begins with Gimel. See that? But what happened to Dalet Hey Vav? In this machzor, to just be more expeditious, they removed vast sections. Otherwise, the entire alphabet is included in this. They just removed a bunch of them. So they took what would be a 2 or 2.5 page piyut and just put it into one page, so at least we can be exposed to the beauty of this poem. So only 1/3 of it is here. But
Who makes that decision to the people who like publish the book? Who decides, well, I'm going to stop it here?
the publisher. And if you don't like it, you do as this publisher did. He started his own publishing company so he could publish it the way he wanted. I have machzorim that are, probably 6 times the size of this, that have like every piyut. And when I was trained as a chazan, you learn how to chant every piyut, because you never know which ones are going to appear where. And all of the melodies deserve to be retained in some manner, because I'm the repository of all those melodies. If I don't use them in some way, they disappear. They're no longer used. So there's a melody just for this that's only sung here. Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai himlo, leolam va'ed. And it's only used here, on this one page, never again. But this isn't the only rhyming part and creativity. Let's look at the first verse, and I want to see what other things you see here. So let's look at it's really the second line down, the first of the 3 stanza parts. Adirei ayuma yadiru vikol. What did the writer do here? Each of the first 3 words begins with an aleph. See it? Adirei, ayuma, yadiru. All right, yadiru is the second letter because he had to. But each of the 3 words are aleph words. And then how does the phrase end? Vikol, with voice. Second line. Bru'e varak yivaruchu. Bet. Now a bet and a vet are interchangeable. It's just a dot or no dot. In terms of Hebrew, it's the same letter. Bet, vet, and then yivaruchu. So what happens again? Another verb with the yud beginning, and then the verb. Third line. Giborei gova yagbiru. Gimel, gimel, gimel. Again with the verb, with the yud, because of how Hebrew works. And then the line ends with vikol. If you scan down the whole page, all of it ends with vikol, with God's voice, with proclamation. Now, so who are the ones saying it? Is it God? No. Us. So as you can see the interesting translation, sages and saints joyously proclaim. Vikol means, in this translation, joyously proclaim. And they proclaim what? Adonai Melech, God rules. The angels on high in blessing acclaim. The Lord was king. The mighty ones powerfully exclaim, the Lord shall be king forever. So you see how the English, they tried to rhyme it to reflect the rhyming patterns in the Hebrew. But you got all these different rhyming patterns. You have the repetition of part of the phrase, you have vikol, and then within each line, 3 letters of the alphabet, the same letter 3 times. That continues throughout this entire poem. Think about how complex it is for someone to sit and think how they're going to create that. Unfortunately, with all of these poems, we don't get footnotes of the creative process, which I can only say for me as a chazan would be fascinating to read. How did you come up with this? Is it that you took Adonai Melech, Adonai Leolam Va'ed, you took that and said, I'm going to write a poem with that, and how am I going to do it, and here's how I did it, and this is what I want to do? What was the process, which could just be so fascinating and instructional? And it could be because I'm just a machzor nerd, and I like that kind of stuff. But for me, it's fascinating. How did you get to it? Because nobody wrote one like this, except this one. You don't find another one composed like this, which is fascinating. So you see, another different style. So we've looked at 3 different types of religious poems, all 3 totally different. I couldn't find the sources on that. My expectation would be most likely somewhere in the Middle Ages. That's when most of these religious poems were written. That doesn't mean that there weren't other periods of great religious poetry being written. But it just seems somewhere between the 7th and 11th was an incredibly, profoundly inspirational period for the writing of Jewish religious poetry. Incredible. More so than any other period. Okay, on to another type of poem. Page 170. So notice we haven't gone far. Within a short distance, we have all of this stuff on one page. It begins with 4 little words on top of V'chein lechal hakol yachtiru, a short permission. Remember, we need permissions to add stuff? Here's a short permission. Uvechein means literally, and therefore, lecha, to you, hakol yachtiru, everything proclaims your kingship. Keter is a crown. So everything proclaims your kingship. And then who was this being addressed to? Le'el orech din. To God. El is another name of God. Le'el. Orech din is the one who sits in judgment. And what do we find here? Each phrase ends with the word din. Din means judgment. And they start with a lamed. Yeah, each of them starts with lamed. Each of them ends with din. Well, the first half ends with din. The second half, they say, ends with ba din. The question is, how is it composed and what is the manner in which we find it? This is what we call an alphabetical acrostic. An alphabetical acrostic means that the poem follows an alphabetical formula. Most alphabetical poems in Hebrew go Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. The most famous one that all of you know, Ashrei. Ashrei is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. It's only missing the letter Nun. We don't know why. It's not there. They did find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, an Ashrei with Nun. But all the other versions has no Nun. We don't know why. So this begins Le'el. So after the Le on the second line, the word El is an Aleph. Follow me on this now. Go to the second line down where the 2 columns begin. After the Lamed, the Le, we have the Hebrew letter Vet, right? The second Hebrew letter of the alphabet. Stay on this second line down. Go across to the next line. Le, and then we have Gole. Gimel, see it? Go to the next line down of this 2-column prayer. Le, and then a Daled. You can see Aleph, Vet, Gimel, Daled, all the way through the alphabet. That's the pattern and how this one was written. But it's not the first letter, because who is this being addressed to? This is being addressed to Le, to God. The one who. So it's as though each phrase begins with saying, to the one who, and now they fill in the blank. To the one who searches all hearts on the day of judgment. To the one who reveals the hidden things in judgment. To the one who decides righteously on the day of judgment. To the one who knows our innermost secrets in judgment. So you can see. They do that again for the poetry. They're trying to show you the poetry by having each one begin with he to rhyme with the le at the beginning. Now, this double column can also remind us of something in judgment. What do we know if that's a 2-column 10 Commandments? So it brings a reckoning to the 10 Commandments and 10 Commandments. And where were we when 10 Commandments occurred? We were at Mount Sinai. What happened? God revealed God's presence at Mount Sinai. the most powerful moment in the Jewish people. It's as though we're reconnecting to the Ten Commandment powerful moment by seeing this image of the Ten Commandments. Because remember, we're not allowed any images. Think about it. The Machzor has no images, no pictures, unless there was some individual who decided to add graffiti to the Machzor in some creative, expressive way. So we have that. But not only do we have the Aleph and the Bet, the end of each of the phrases on the right hand of the column, B'yom Din, on the day of judgment. And then Badin, in judgment. So the theme of this entire is about God as being judge. This one became so powerful that we open the ark for it in most congregations, whereas we don't always specifically open the ark for every piyut. But this one historically has taken on greater import in the service. So how is this one recited in most congregations? In a really peculiar way that makes no sense whatsoever. Notice how it's composed. You have an opening verse on the top, then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, and then 1 on the bottom. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So why didn't they have just 11 sets? 11 isn't a magic number. 10 is. That's why they did it. 1, 10, and then 2. Because 10 is the magic number. 10 Commandments. 10 is the magic number. So that's why it's 1, 10 pairs, and 1, as opposed to 11. 11 is not a magic number in Jewish ritual, in Jewish superstition. So it isn't done that way. And how is it recited? The Chazan, and this tradition goes back easily 1,000 years. After the Chazan opens with the first line, Le'el Orech Din, the Chazan chants the first two on the top of the double column. In most congregations, they do one of two things. They repeat those same two lines, or in some, they'll go on and they'll chant the next two lines, but then the Chazan repeats them. So the pattern is to use this duple. So what I generally do is I'll chant the first two lines, I'll wait for a moment to let the congregation respond with the same two lines, and then I'll chant the next two. They repeat the same two, and then continue. Why is it done that way? I don't know, it's a tradition. I don't know why it's done that way. Each of our poems have unique ways that they're recited. This one takes on some sort of unique importance that that's the way that it's chanted. So the first line the congregation really doesn't utter. The Chazan chants the second line, both the Bet and the Gimel words. The congregation repeats them. The Chazan then does the Gimel Daled words, except when we get to the end. We get to the end, the Chazan chants the last three phrases, and the congregation repeats them, and then the ark is closed, but they remain standing because of the Kedusha, which is Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We stand for that. So, once again, a fourth religious poem, and if you can reflect upon it for just a moment, all four of these are totally different. And they're also within literally 6 pages of each other. 4 totally, completely different poems. Some themes might run among all of them that are the same, but the content, the structure, and how they're recited are all totally different. The opening two that were the small print I showed you, the congregation doesn't utter. But in many congregations, what they do is the Chazan will recite the first 2 lines, or sometimes the first 3, and then the congregation will utter a chant on a syllable. For example, if we go back for a moment, I'll just demonstrate to you how does that work. On 164. So, first day of Rosh Hashanah, since I'm the one doing it, I would do Yareti bivtzoti siach lahashil Kumi lechalot ben ra v'dachil. And in traditional congregations that people all know all of this davening, they would go, ah. After each duple, they do that, ah. So congregation would be involved in the prayer, not by saying a word, because they're not allowed to. Only the chazan says it. They would respond with that. I don't think it was merely a function of the chazan catching the breath or getting a drink of water. That's how these developed. So many of them developed in different ways. So each of these developed most likely based upon the person who wrote it. I don't expect that in some other synagogue it developed that this melody was added. I wouldn't be surprised if the original composer of this included that at some point to find a way for the congregation to participate. Otherwise, they're standing in front, they're standing in the congregation, the ark is open, the chazan is reciting this, and they're just standing there. Now remember, the printing press wasn't invented yet. Listen. So the religious experience was all about listening. So opportunities to participate were really important for the worshipers, particularly to keep them awake. Yes?
How varied are the mazurs from Germany to Russia?
Great question.
To Spain. You were saying that some have different poems,
Right.
different prayers.
The biggest difference you'll find is between the Ashkenazic Jews, those are the Jews of Europe, and the Sephardic Jews, the Jews who lived around the Mediterranean. Because you'll find that the poetry in the Sephardic Siddur Machzorim represents Sephardic piyutim. A great number of them were composed when the Jews lived in Moorish Spain, years before the explosion during the Golden Age of Spain. Most of that poetry was written there. The poetry in the Ashkenazic ones, a great amount of it, but not all of it, a great amount of it was written by incredibly talented poets who lived in central Germany. So if you would then, say, be davening in a synagogue before, say around the 15th century, before the printing press had made its way around that everyone could get a copy, an affordable copy, because even when they were printed, there were very few copies because they were still really expensive, you would find then the poetry would be reflective of the city or the region. If you would have a congregation where the chazan was an incredible poet and wrote dozens of poems, you'd find those personal compositions, much like a talented chazan who's a musical composer. You might find a lot of his or her compositions sung in that congregation, as an example. As time went on, people travel, there's loaning, there's borrowing. And that's what the Machzor reflects, is that concept of the borrowing and loaning that's spread around. So in today's world, you'll find that the poetry in the Machzor reflects the movement that the synagogue connects with, meaning Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Humanist, for example, as well as then within any movement, which iteration of that Machzor do they use? We use this one because our movement has a newer Machzor that's out. There are different iterations of a conservative Machzor, different iterations of a Reform Machzor. So each one has different elements in it that reflects the choices of the committee that was editing it and determining it, with input from many other people, but ultimately that committee and the chair of that committee is going to decide what's going to go in the newest form. And each form has differences in it. Sometimes they'll say we've gone way too in one direction by eliminating quite a number of elements. We want to go back and reincorporate some of those elements that are lost. Or some may go way to one way and say, we've got way too much, we're losing the people, we need to cut back on what's in the Machzor to reconnect people and to shorten the service. So within particularly the Reform and conservative movements, we find a pendulum effect over the decades. They go to one direction where it's very full, back where they begin to shorten. Now, oh, it's too short, we took out too much, go back the other way. It kind of keeps going back and forth, but it's not that it's going to find a center point and stop pivoting. It's going to be, I think, forever going back and forth like this. Too much, not enough. Too much, not enough. Over decades going back and forth between it. So, we're at 8 o'clock. I wanted to just take a few moments to touch upon major elements that are contained in Musaf, which is a totally different service on Rosh Hashanah than any other day of the year. First off, it's subdivided the major section into 3 sections. And each of the 3 sections culminates with the sounding of the shofar, which in and of itself is a unique experience in a service to have it. Of course, not on Shabbat. The first section is called by the name Malchuyot. The short word is Melech, king. And how did they compose this? The writers of it took 3 phrases from the Torah that reflect God's kingship. That the word, at least one word in that selected snippet, has the word Melech in it. Now, it could be one verse, it could be 2 or 3 lines, even a little short paragraph. The first 3 selections are from the Torah. The next 3 are taken from the prophets, which is the middle section of the Jewish Bible. 3 selections from the prophets, all with the word Melech in it somewhere. Then 3 selections are taken from the writings. That's the concluding section of the Jewish Bible. The writings are known, for example, the Psalms are in the writings, as an example of what's contained there. 3, and then they go back once again, the concluding verse, to have 1 verse from the Torah again. Why? 10. You can't have 9. 9 isn't a Jewish number. 10 is a Jewish number. So you have 10 verses that are selections from somewhere in the Bible that talks of God's kingship. We then conclude and blow the shofar. So that's the Malchiot section. The next is the Zichronot section. Zocher means to remember. What kind of remembering? Remembering that God did. So what kind of remembering did God did? God remembered Noah and ended the flood waters. God remembered Sarah and came back and made sure Sarah had a son, right? Those are some of the rememberings that God did. So we have 3 verses of God remembering something in the Torah, 3 verses of the prophets, 3 verses from the Psalms, and then 1 more verse from the Torah of God remembering. And then we send the shofar again. So we have the first section, the kingship verses, 10 of them. Then the remembering verses, 10 of them with the shofar. Then the last, shofrot, 10 verses about the sounding of the shofar. For example, we know that at Mount Sinai, the Torah tells us there was the sound of the shofar and the thunder and the lightning. So you're going to find verses from that. So you're going to find 3 verses from the Torah about the shofar, 3 verses from the prophets about shofar, 3 from the Psalms about shofar, then 1 more from the Torah, and then we send the shofar again. These 3 unique sections are highlights of the Musaf service. You'll only find them in Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur. Now, why the sounding of the shofar? What's so big about the shofar? Does the shofar have anything to do with the creation of the world? Does it? Did God sound the shofar when the world was created? No. So what's the sounding of the shofar have to do with all of this Rosh Hashanah stuff? Why? If it's not the creation, then why are we sounding it? Wake up. Wake up for what? The day of judgment. Not gospel singers going, hallelujah, hallelujah, the day of judgment. No, not that kind of day of judgment. What's Yom Kippur? Judgment. Rosh Hashanah begins 10 days of penitence. 10 days where we should have, in the previous 30, been reflecting upon our deeds this month, using the workbook that I sent everyone in an email in the e-tree to be using every day to reflect upon your life. And during those 10 days, we're supposed to go to every person we've wronged and apologize. Even if it means I may have offended you unintentionally during the year and don't remember. That being the case, will you please accept my apology for something I may have unwittingly done. That's an example of a type of an apology one can do. Even though you would think, I never said anything to offend that person or anybody. None of us can be that way, because none of us can be that haughty. We're imperfect. That means we make mistakes. Part of those mistakes are we can say the wrong thing and not even know it. 10 days from the beginning of Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur to say, I'm sorry to the people we've offended. Well, then what's Yom Kippur about? Who's the last one we didn't say we're sorry to yet? God. 25 hours to say, I'm sorry, God, for the promises I made that I didn't keep, the commandments I broke, the ways that I've offended you, the ways that I've brought shame to your great name by the things that I've said and done. 25 hours to say, I'm sorry, God. Rosh Hashanah is the final wake-up call going, well, if you slept through all of Elul and didn't do anything to think about yourself, you never got 10 days, come on, get it together. Because when Yom Kippur starts, it's done. No more saying I'm sorry to other people. You had 40 days to do it, that magic 40-day number. Now it's time to focus on God. You probably want to do that because we're not responsible for what happens to you when you leave the place of worship. If a gargoyle suddenly falls off as you leave, you know, you probably didn't do your best to say, I'm sorry, God, for how I've offended you. So that's why I think we really sound shofar. Not because the Torah maybe tells us, but I think it's the alarm clock, last-minute reminder. Why? Because humans are procrastinators by nature. We just are. We recognize it. And therefore, we need that last second, psst, psst, the poking of the finger, the elbow, all the reminders. And I think Rosh Hashanah is to remind us of the majesty of God's creation, but yet despite that majesty, we screw up. So I thank you for being part of the journey we've just begun to arrive at Rosh Hashanah. May you find the remaining days of Elul a meaningful opportunity to really reflect on you and your life. And may you all be inscribed for a good year, the coming year. Thank you all. Thank you to the people downstairs in the crypt keeper, and all the people downstairs for broadcasting. Thank you for those who joined us virtually. Bavakasha.